Why do you start everything with enthusiasm and abandon it just when it gets difficult? Why does the more you force yourself to be consistent, the faster you lose interest? Is it a lack of discipline, a character flaw, or is there something in your brain pushing you to give up? And if you're not the only one, why does this pattern repeat in so many intelligent and curious people? Stick around because understanding this mechanism completely changes how you see yourself. If you look back honestly, you can probably list a long series of things you started with excitement and left halfway through. A musical instrument gathering dust in a corner, a language you abandoned after the first few lessons, a book you never got halfway through, a personal project that seemed promising and quietly faded away. It's not an isolated case. It's a pattern that repeats over and over again. At first, everything is energy. You feel like this time is different, that now you found something new. You learn fast, you move quickly, and motivation seems inexhaustible. But after a while, something changes. Progress slows down, the excitement dilutes, and a hard-to-explain resistance appears. You start procrastinating, getting distracted, avoiding that project that used to excite you. And then comes the guilt. The usual narrative is harsh. You tell yourself you lack consistency, that you don't know how to commit, that you always do the same thing. From the outside, others even reinforce that idea with labels like fickle or incapable of finishing what you start. Little by little, that explanation becomes an identity. It's no longer that you abandon things. It's that you're just like that. But this is where the original content asks the key question. What if the problem wasn't your character? What if that sequence of enthusiasm and abandonment wasn't a moral failing, but the consequence of how your brain functions when it moves from novelty to routine? Because what almost no one explains is that not all phases of learning activate the same internal mechanisms. This point is fundamental to understanding everything that follows. Before judging yourself, before trying to force yourself to be different, you need to understand exactly what happens at that moment when motivation disappears. Only then can you stop seeing yourself as someone flawed and start seeing the pattern clearly. The most common mistake is interpreting that abandonment as a sign of laziness or a lack of discipline. The original content is very clear on this point. That explanation is convenient, but false. If you were truly lazy, you wouldn't even start so many things. However, what defines you isn't an absence of initiative, but quite the opposite. You are drawn to learning, exploring, and understanding. And that has a biological basis. The human brain has a deep drive to acquire knowledge. Novelty activates very powerful reward systems. When you start something new, learning is fast, progress is visible, and the sense of advancement is immediate. The brain interprets that stage as highly valuable and releases motivation almost automatically. You don't need to force yourself. Everything flows. The problem appears when that novelty disappears. When there are no longer quick jumps in improvement and progress becomes slow, repetitive, and less obvious. At that moment, the brain stops receiving the same reward, not because the project has stopped being interesting, but because the type of stimulus has changed. Initial curiosity is no longer fed in the same way. Here, the original content introduces an important distinction. Not all people who try many things are inconsistent. Some are explorers by nature. Others are designed to integrate diverse knowledge. The conflict arises when you try to fit that impulse into a model that only values extreme specialization and constant repetition. When you don't understand this mechanism, you start fighting against yourself. You try to suppress curiosity, force yourself to tough it out, and ignore the discomfort. But that internal friction doesn't eliminate the problem. It only postpones it. And the more you force yourself without understanding, the faster the rejection is triggered. This change in perspective is essential. It's not about justifying abandonment, but about understanding what causes it. Because only when you understand the root of the pattern can you consciously decide if you want to push through that phase or redesign how you commit to what you start. This is where the original content gets into one of its most important points, the role of dopamine. When you start something new, your brain experiences what is known as a novice high. Everything is stimulating. Every small step forward feels huge. You learn fast, you improve visibly, and that sense of progress feeds motivation almost effortlessly. It's not a coincidence. It's chemistry. But this phase doesn't last. As you move forward, you inevitably reach a plateau. Progress becomes slower, less visible. There are no longer big leaps, only small improvements that require repetition. At that moment, dopamine levels drop. The brain stops receiving the same immediate reward and starts looking for new stimuli elsewhere. Most people interpret this drop as a sign that they chose poorly. Maybe this wasn't for me, they think. But the original content is clear. This point appears in any real learning process. It doesn't matter if it's music, languages, programming, or writing. The difference between those who continue and those who quit isn't in the initial passion, but in how they navigate this uncomfortable stage. Here, a central confusion arises. You think you've lost interest when, in reality, you've lost the chemical reinforcement that pushed you at the beginning. Deep interest usually appears later, but to get there, it's necessary to tolerate a phase where the brain doesn't cooperate with enthusiasm. This is the exact moment when many give up, not because they are incapable, but because no one explained to them that this friction is part of the process. The brain isn't failing. It's reacting predictably to the absence of novelty. Understanding this completely changes the interpretation of abandonment. It's no longer about a lack of character, but about a misunderstood biological response. And once you identify this critical point, you can start to decide consciously whether you want to push through it or if you're going to keep repeating the same cycle over and over. At this point, the original content introduces a specific brain structure that is almost never mentioned when talking about consistency. The AMCCT, the anterior mid-cingulate cortex. This area is related to the ability to persist in tasks that are no longer pleasurable but remain important. It has nothing to do with initial motivation, but rather with the tolerance for discomfort. Here a key idea emerges. Willpower is not a moral trait or a fixed quality. It is a neurological function that can be more or less developed based on experience. Some people seem to handle boredom or frustration better not because they are superior, but because their brain has learned to sustain that type of effort. The problem is that when you reach the plateau and dopamine drops, this region is what needs to kick in. If it isn't trained, resistance appears immediately. You don't just feel bored, you feel rejection. The brain interprets the task as something to be avoided and seeks to escape toward more rewarding stimuli. The original content compares this region to a muscle. If it's never been used, any load feels excessive. And if you abandon things every time discomfort appears, the brain learns a clear lesson. Running away works. Over time, the tolerance for sustained effort decreases even further. This is where many people get confused. They believe the problem is discipline or a lack of passion when, in reality, it's a trained inability to sustain boredom. Not because there is anything wrong with them, but because they were never taught how to go through this phase without interpreting it as a sign of failure. Understanding the role of the AMCC is fundamental because it moves the problem from the realm of personal judgment to the realm of brain function. And once you make that shift, the question stops being, what's wrong with me, and becomes, what do I need to train? Once the role of the AMCC is understood, the original content proposes a specific way to train it without falling into the error of forcing yourself to exhaustion. Here the principle of progressive overload appears. Just as a muscle isn't strengthened by lifting the maximum weight from day one, this capacity isn't developed by pushing yourself to the limit all at once. The idea is simple but powerful. Instead of demanding absolute consistency, it's about increasing discomfort just a little bit more than what you already tolerate. An additional 10 or 15%. If you read 10 pages without a problem, read 11. If you practice for 20 minutes, stretch it for 2 or 3 more. The goal isn't to suffer, but to teach the brain that it can stay on task a little longer without anything negative happening. This approach completely changes the experience. Discomfort stops being a threat and becomes a manageable signal. Little by little, the AMCC receives repeated proof that it isn't necessary to escape as soon as novelty disappears. And with each repetition, tolerance increases. The original content emphasizes that this process must be consistent, not heroic. Sporadic great efforts don't train anything. What strengthens this capacity is the daily repetition of small, conscious decisions. Staying a little longer when the impulse is to quit, not much longer. Just enough to send a different signal to the nervous system. An important warning also appears here. Pushing too fast produces the opposite effect. The brain associates the task with intense suffering, reinforces avoidance. That's why the key isn't in toughness, but in precision, knowing exactly how far to stretch without breaking. This point marks a clear transition in the narrative. It's no longer just about understanding why you abandon things, but about how to start changing that pattern in a sustainable way. Not through guilt, but through the conscious training of a function you were never taught to develop. In this section, the original content introduces a fundamental clarification. Not all brains respond the same way to sustained effort. Especially when there are ADHD traits, the idea of relying solely on willpower is not only ineffective, but unfair. The problem isn't a lack of intention, but a different regulation of attention in the reward system. This is where the concept of scaffolding or support structure comes in. Instead of demanding that the brain function in a hostile environment, the environment is modified to make the task more accessible. Breaking the work into small blocks, using timers, working with someone else, or introducing game elements isn't cheating. It's adapting the system to how your mind actually works. The original content insists that many people fail because they try to apply strategies designed for other brain types. They compare themselves, get frustrated, and reinforce the idea that something is defective in them. But when they change the context, performance changes with surprising speed. Not because they suddenly have more discipline, but because they stop fighting against their own biology. Another key point saw that these tools don't eliminate the need for effort. What they do is reduce initial friction, that critical moment when the mind resists starting or continuing. Once inside the task, the brain responds better. The real enemy isn't the work itself, but the invisible barrier that appears before starting. Understanding this difference is liberating. It means you don't need to become another person to be consistent. You need to design a system that takes your real limits into account. When you do that, consistency stops feeling like a daily struggle and starts looking more like a sequence of possible decisions. The original content closes with a reflection that ties all the pieces together. The greatest enemy of consistency today isn't a lack of talent, but an intolerance for boredom. We live surrounded by stimuli that offer immediate and constant rewards. Social media, short videos, notifications. The brain gets used to dopamine levels so high that any slow, repetitive task begins to feel unbearable. In this context, crossing the plateau is not only difficult, it's unnatural for an overstimulated brain. The drop in dopamine is perceived as a void that must be filled immediately. And the fastest way to do that is to abandon what became uncomfortable and start something new. The cycle repeats, not out of weakness, but because of conditioning. That's why the original content proposes a clear idea. If you want to break this pattern, you need to redefine your relationship with boredom. Not eliminate it, but learn to remain in it long enough for the brain to readjust. Reduce external stimulation, accept periods of low reward, and commit to a single thing for an extended time. It's not about becoming someone rigid or monotonous. It's about giving yourself the chance to discover what lies beyond the uncomfortable phase you always abandon. Because that's where true competence, deep understanding, and a different kind of motivation, less explosive, but much more stable, appear. The closing is powerful. You aren't someone incapable of finishing what they start. You are someone whose brain learned to run away just before the important part began. And that is a skill that, with awareness and practice, can also be unlearned.